Does Wuxia have anything in common with spaghetti westerns? Maybe a bit of a strange question, but I've got a guest on the show for this episode who thinks that yes, it definitely does, and that's a certain somebody who goes by the name Deathblade. He's not as ominous as that name might suggest. Before we get on to my chat with him about Gulong's 7 Killers and his translation of it, we're going to do the news, the terrific news. Terrific, for new listeners, that's the name of the show, translated Chinese fiction. Not, as I reiterate, the Church of Fake News. That would be on a different podcast. So our first news item, it's a self-referential one. I've made a little web page on our Podbean host site that should be really interesting or really handy for anyone listening who's into Chinese sci-fi. So if you just go to my Podbean site, terrific, so trchfic.podbean.com, there's a wee link on the left that says the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast series or season. So basically, a wee while ago on the show, I did a whole string of episodes all about Chinese sci-fi, and I've made a page dedicated to that series. So it's a list of all the episodes with a wee embedded player and a brief description of what the episode's about, and obviously who's on it, and a picture of every author as well. So a really handy thing for any of you guys who haven't listened to that season of episodes or didn't catch every single episode and want to get an overview of what they maybe missed. Go there and you won't be disappointed. The second piece of news, it's kind of a follow-on from our last episode's news about the Paper Republic Sunday sentence, where they put up a very small snippet of text from a book. They put up the original Chinese, and then everyone is free to have their own shot at translating that snippet of text, sharing it in the comments on the page. So I guess that does two things. It lets you have a shot. If you've ever wanted to translate, you can have a shot at doing a little nugget of it, and it just shows up the fun thing where everyone gets a slightly different product from the same source, or a different result from the same source. So fun wee thing. So I'll link to that in the show notes if you'd like to give it a try. I think they'd like people to do it within the coming week, but obviously I think the page is going to stay up there. So if you're listening far into the future, I think that link will still be active, but we shall see. Now, the last piece of terrific news in this episode relates to our discussion that's coming up between me and Deathblade, and it's about China Literature, which is an arm of Tencent. So they publish a lot of web novels and content and whatnot. They have undergone some drama regarding contracts with authors, and me and Deathblade are going to talk about that and the kind of crazy controversies that have been caused in the world of Chinese to English and Chinese web novel publishing. It's crazy, but I think Deathblade shared an article about these legal dramas from Caixin, and I just tried to get on that today, and it's paywalled, but I found an article discussing the same story on technode.com, so I'm going to put links to, I think, just the Technode article, but the Caixin one you can find as well. It's up there online. So yeah, that's the terrific news out the way. Let's get on and hear what me and Jeremy, that's Deathblade's name, he's called Jeremy, what me and Jeremy have to say to each other about Gulong's 7 Killers and about Wuxia and Wuxia's sibling genres and publishing them online rather than in books. Pretty fun stuff, for nerds like me anyway. So I've got Deathblade on the line, although I'm probably just going to call you Jeremy. So Jeremy, how's it going and what have you been up to?
Well, I'm doing good. I hope you're doing well. I think we're all on lockdown at this point, or have been for some time. So After almost 3 months, I think I've kind of gotten used to it. I generally work from home. So in terms of my work, it hasn't really changed much, but normally I don't have everybody else at home with me all the time, including my 4-year-old. So the past couple months have taken some adjustment. At this point, I'm kind of settled into a sort of a rhythm, I think.
You're over in the States?
Yep, I'm in Southern California.
Right. So it's probably a bit warmer where you are than where I am.
I would guess so. San Diego, I'm in San Diego, and it supposedly has the best weather in the United States. I think that's probably true. It never snows. It doesn't rain much. It doesn't get humid. It gets hot, but not too hot. And, you know, a little bit cold, but not too cold. So, yeah, I think I have it kind of lucky in that regard.
Yeah. Speaking of being at home with everyone else, the person I know that's enjoying lockdown the most is my dog, because he's back in my mum's house and he's got all the attention from all the humans every day. So I think dogs are the biggest winners in this lockdown.
Yeah, this is a cat house. I'm actually with my parents at the moment. It's kind of a really long and complicated story how I ended up here. But they're a cat house, and I think it's probably the same for the cats.
Oh, that's good. They must be sociable cats.
Well, there's one that's very sociable, and then the other two are these, you know, twin Siamese that definitely think they run the house, but are also kind of scaredy cats at the same time. They're not as friendly, but the other one is super, super friendly. So that's been fun. It's been a nice addition to the lockdown monotony, I guess.
Well, there's absolutely no way I can pretend this is relevant to the show, but a lot of my childhood was spent with two Siamese cats in the house, although I think it sounds like they're a bit more friendly than your parents' ones.
Well, there you go. Yeah, these ones are very vocal and seem very smart, but they don't particularly like getting pet other than by their dad, which is my dad. So I guess we're kind of sort of like siblings in a way.
Yeah, I think all Siamese cats are vocal, and it's unfortunately not a very adorable meow that they've got. More of like a
yeah.
They always
when we
sound
first
angry or
came here,
depressed.
my wife was like messaging the family saying, "I think I heard a baby crying in the house," and you know, it turned out to be the cats. But yeah, we've gotten used to it.
I'm not going to treat the listeners to my Siamese cat impression. I'll save that for the Patreon. Right. So let's get back on track. You're a translator, but you're pretty different from the other various translators I've had on the show. They've all been kind of, to speak quite broadly, translators who are translating for like a traditional book publishing market, but you're not quite the same. Rather than me outright asking you, what kind of translator are you? How about I ask you to give the listeners an idea of like your journey and maybe your self-cultivation as a translator of Wuxia?
Sure. It's actually kind of funny because I have a YouTube channel where I talk about the kind of novels that I translate and stuff related to Chinese culture and whatnot. And I just recorded a video about this exact subject because I get this question a lot. People wanting to know, how did I become a translator? How did I learn Chinese and those things? So I actually just recorded that video and I have not yet edited and released it. Eventually that video will be on my YouTube channel and it'll be a lot easier for people to kind of hear my story. So I'll kind of give the abridged version here. Basically, I got interested specifically in Chinese culture when I watched the movie Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon in the year 2000. I had always been kind of interested in Asian culture in general and Chinese culture as well, but that movie really sort of it really sparked my imagination and it got me super interested in the genre. I was researching it, reading all of the fan translations that I could find. And then fast forward a few years, I went back to college. And the Cliff Notes on that is that after graduating high school, I went into the family business and didn't need to go to college, but I kind of wanted to later. So I went back to college, and when I got toward the end of college and I was about to graduate, this was roughly, I guess, maybe 5 or 6 years of sort of like being interested in Chinese culture, being interested in wuxia and stuff. I decided to take a vacation to China at the end of my college career, which I did. And then that just made it worse or better, I guess, whichever way you want to look at it. I just got even more obsessed with, Chinese culture, language and whatnot. And so I started studying the language formally. Before going on the vacation, I had done the whole learn how to say hello and where's the bathroom kind of thing. But when I came back, I really kind of started taking it seriously and started studying. I took a crash course at first, but everything else was all self-taught. Fast forward another couple years, I ended up moving to New York City. I got a job in the financial district at a computer game company. And the financial district, it's in South Manhattan. I decided if I'm going to work there, I definitely have to live in Chinatown. So I moved to Manhattan, Chinatown, where I lived for a couple years, furthering my understanding of the culture and language. Then after that, the writing on the wall came for that company, and I decided to leave, and I just moved to China to teach English, which is the easiest way to move there. I was in the game industry, but I really didn't want to end up in one of the big cities, which is where the game industry in China is centered. In my idealistic mind, I wanted to go, to the country, not the countryside, but I just didn't really want to be in the big metropolis. And so that's what I did. I went and taught English in a kind of a small city in China. After a couple years in China, I realized that my reading ability was very, very low. And so in order to force myself to read more, I decided, hey, I should try reading one of these novels, one of these wuxia novels that sort of was one of the instigating factors that got me onto the path of being interested in China and the language and the culture. So that's what I did. I read the novel 7 Killers by Gulong. The reason being it was a very short novel. It was like the shortest one I could find. And after reading it, I decided, hey, why don't I try translating this? Because one of the things that had originally also been a big factor in my sort of path of going down the Chinese culture and language side was fan translations of wuxia novels. And so I did that. I translated that novel 7 Killers. I posted it online. And then after that, I translated another one, and I translated another one, and I translated another book. Now, these initial books are all traditional classic wuxia novels. Well, the one of them was more of a modern novel, and it's kind of a horror wuxia novel, not a classic one. But the point is, I initially started out translating actual literary classic wuxia novels. And then a few years after that was when the whole online web novel translation scene exploded. And at that point, I had translated quite a bit in terms of wuxia novels. There's not exactly a lot of people out there translating them, especially on the literary side. Right now, the Condor Heroes translation is finally kind of starting to make some headway. But before that, there wasn't really any professional translators out there translating this stuff, to be honest. And so the point is that the online scene exploded. I got sucked into it and ended up doing it full time. And so that's what I've been doing for the past several years. And so I guess if you were going to sort of encapsulate it, I would say that I was one of those people who just kind of went out and did it. I learned the hard way, and I put a lot of work into it. At this point, I've translated somewhere around 12 or 13 million characters of Chinese fiction. That's a lot. It's if you translated that into words, that's going to be something like probably 4 or 5 of the Harry Potter series put together, or maybe 2 or 3 of the Wheel of Time series put together. So it's a lot of content, and I learned by doing and by teaching myself, as opposed to kind of, coming at it from the other direction. So sorry, that's kind of a little bit of a monologue there, but that sort of encapsulates my story in a nutshell, I think.
Well, you'll be glad to hear that I was taking notes to keep the questions I wanted to ask you in response in my head, or rather store them outside my head on the paper. So I'm going to go through them backwards. I think that's the most logical way to do it. So you said that there was a moment when the web novel, online wuxia scene exploded. So I'm not assuming you'll necessarily know, but I'm wondering about the why and the how of that. Was there a reason it blew up at the time that it did?
Well, if you want to get into deep, sociological factors, I don't claim to be an expert on that. But the long-form, high fantasy Chinese cultivation stuff is a new thing, and it's exotic, it's different. Nothing like it really existed in the Western world. And so when that started getting translated at a relatively high speed, it just picked up traction very, very quickly. The original novel that started it all was called Stellar Transformations, and that was being translated on spcnet.tv, which is where I also posted my translations. And it was just, almost an overnight sensation, I think, just because it was so different and interesting and unique. And then Coiling Dragon was the next one that kind of got really popular, and then the translator of Coiling Dragon is the one who started Wuxia World, and then, it literally was an explosion. I'm talking within a matter of months and maybe even a year at most, there were websites popping up, people translating stuff, money getting thrown around and whatnot. And I'm not an expert in terms of why all of this stuff happened. I personally think it's just because it was something so new and different. That's my take on it.
And that website you mentioned, that this explosion could be traced back to what was it called? spc.tv?
spcnet.tv. If you go to that website, you have to go to the forums, and you click on the forum section and then scroll down, and there is a Wuxia translations sub forum. And that is where I originally posted all of my translations, and that's where Stellar Transformations and Coiling Dragon both took off. And the forums are still kind of mildly active. Like, there are still some people posting translations here and there, but it quickly moved beyond that to specifically Wuxia World at first, but there were a couple other major sites like Gravity Tales and Valere Novels. And then when the Chinese publishers stepped in, that's when kind of everything sort of, I don't want to use the wrong word, but it kind of just destabilized, and a lot of bad stuff happened. A lot of dramatic stuff happened legally and just in the online world, and things got shaken up. And nowadays there are a couple major sites by the major publishers, and then Wuxia World, and that's it for the most part in terms of what is being legally translated, licensed officially, and whatnot.
Okay, I can think of maybe one of these publishers that you're thinking of. But I remember when I went with my publishing master's course to the London Book Fair, I was looking for anything related to China that might be worth visiting, because I was gearing up to do a dissertation on translated Chinese sci-fi from a publishing perspective. And one of the companies that stood out as being a bit different were called Webnovel. And then I learned from them. They're like an international English language extension of this Chinese web novel site, web novel company based in Shenzhen. So are they what you mean by like the Chinese publishers getting involved? One of these large, because TGN are part of Tencent, which is a huge company. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about, or would you rather not
that's
say?
exactly what I'm talking about. Basically, TGN is like the top publisher of this kind of stuff. There are a few other sites that could kind of be considered competition, but they're really the top site. All the top authors are there. And, this is a subject that could actually probably be the subject of a book, to be honest, because there's so many twists and turns and ins and outs and dramatic things that happen. But to do a very short version, essentially what happened was, so Stellar Transformations and Coiling Dragon became popular. Coiling Dragon was the first novel, I shouldn't say the novel, the translator of Coiling Dragon, who founded Wuxia World, was the first one to really monetize it. He started taking donations to speed up his translation process, and then that caused a bunch of other translators to jump on board and do the same thing, and that eventually drew the attention of Qidian. I say Qidian because you're right, they're backed by Tencent. Webnovel is just their overseas website. Originally they called it Qidian International, then later they changed it to webnovel.com. Basically it attracted their attention, and they were all of a sudden realized, hey, maybe there's a potential market here. Well, the owner of Wuxia World was no fool, and so he wanted to try to, make Wuxia World legitimate. And so he tried to make a deal with them to license novels. He didn't try, he did. He made a deal with them to license the novels. But in the end, what happened was he basically licensed a handful of novels, and then they made a handshake agreement for him to be able to license more novels. Well, if you know much about Chinese culture, then you would probably know that handshake agreements mean less than in the Western world. And basically, and of course, this is my opinion, and don't take this to be canon, but basically, they were kind of playing him because they never intended to give him more licenses. What they wanted to do was buy out Wuxia World. And so they will after they did that initial licensing deal, they started working on a quote unquote investment deal. Now, this investment deal would eventually have led to them buying out Wuxia World completely. That actually happened with another of the major sites, Gravity Tales. Just literally last week, Gravity Tales finally the URL switched to Webnovel. So if you go to Gravity Tales, it redirects you to Webnovel. That was their ultimate goal. But the owner of Wuxia World didn't want to sign the deal because what they wanted was they wanted the translators to sign over all rights to their translations to Qidian or to webnovel.com. That's how they work with the authors as well, at least up until recently. For many, many years, the authors on these websites, they actually don't own the IP to the stuff they write. And so that's what they wanted for translators as well. And the owner of Wuxia World basically was like, no, we're not going to do that because the translators need royalties. It's not fair that they put all the work into it and then you just own it. So in the very, very end, the deal fell through. And then Wuxia World and web novel or Qidian became big enemies. And Qidian went on the war path using every means, fair or foul, to try to discredit and destroy Wuxia World. And in the very end, it didn't really work out. But yeah, so you guessed right. That's basically who I was talking about.
What a weirdly kind of wuxia-esque saga that is.
It absolutely is. And when all of this stuff was happening, those were the kind of comments that were coming up a lot in, on the novel translation subreddit and the forums and whatnot. People were saying, like, you are being just like the bad guys in all of these novels. But they don't care. In the end, they really, really didn't care. They knew that they were powerful enough that the public opinion wouldn't really affect them in the long term. And in the end, again, I'm getting a little bit sidetracked, but part of it was a big strategy on their part because of the Tencent IPO for their novel side. They wanted to just have an international presence that they could use to sort of like, look fancy to investors. That's basically one of the main reasons they were doing web novel. And because of that, they don't really care, at least based on my understanding. They have never cared and don't really care right now about it being profitable. So they were willing to throw huge amounts of money out here and there, buying up, fan translations, buying out websites, doing everything possible to just make their website sort of function and look good without making any money, because they had a huge war chest of cash to work with. And again, it was part of a strategy on the part of Tencent. And there's I think their subsidiary is called China Reading. It was part of their strategy to try to get investors and build their company, not to just, they didn't really care about translating the novels, to be perfectly honest. And that's more than clear now because their website, they've literally stopped hiring qualified translators. They machine translate stuff. They'll machine translate stuff and then say to the audience, basically, well, if you like this, then we'll hire a real translator, and then, you have to pay for it because they don't translate for free, the website in general, I mean. So yeah, it's you hit the nail on the head when you said it was a very kind of wuxia story.
I guess everyone loves a really devious villain.
Yeah, and they have to exist.
Yeah. What you said about trying to attract investors, that rings fairly true to me. I chatted to the web novel people the people representing web novel at London Book Fair. Yeah, one of them in particular, he was very friendly and he was happy to tell me stuff. After the fair, when I reached out to them to be on the show or something, I didn't get anything. But this dude was really charming, and I watched him give a talk to all these different international publishing people at the fair. And yeah, it did kind of seem like the idea was to, one, present themselves, like just introduce themselves, make their presence known, but two, to kind of, it seemed like they were trying to, like what am I trying to say? The people whose interest they were trying to attract would be like large companies with the aim to like have them put in money. But that's about all I can say, and it's probably about all I should say. So let's rewind a bit. You mentioned earlier about cultivation novels. So that's a particular kind of genre, sister genre or subgenre or something related to wuxia. So the homework that I did for this for this wuxia season, and even just reading around online after having met the web novel people, has taught me that there are kind of like a family, I think, of wuxia and wuxia related genres, and the names I've got here on my paper are wuxia, xianxia, and xiahuan. So I want to ask you, number one, are there others that I've missed? And number two, what are these three? Or maybe what are xianxia and xiahuan? Because in my last episode with Gigi Chang, the Jinyong translator, we dealt with wuxia. That one's been explained. So it's xianxia, xiahuan, and any others that are out there that we'd like to know about.
Sure. Well, I think you actually have either a typo or a misspelling or a misunderstanding. The second one is actually xuanhuan, Xuan.
Xuanhuan. Sorry about that, guys.
It's okay.
Xuanhuan, right.
Yeah, so basically I generally refer to both xianxia and xuanhuan as cultivation novels. Cultivation meaning immortal cultivation. The characters of these novels practice generally some kind of magical, immortal cultivation techniques that will allow them to eventually become an immortal, or beyond that. Usually the level of being an immortal is sometimes kind of lower on the totem pole of the ultimate levels that they reach. And The difference between the two is subtle. And so I have a video about this on YouTube as well. It's one of the first videos I did a couple years ago. And I think in that video I mentioned, and I'll reiterate now, I honestly think that for most people it doesn't really matter whether something is xianxia and suanhuan. Like the true fans that read a lot will be able to tell the difference. And in the past, I would often respond in comments to people who would be like, "This is a good xianxia novel," and then I would be like, "Well, actually, it's suanhuan." I've kind of stopped doing that because
you're not a well actually guy anymore.
Yeah, it seems like a little bit petty. But that said, I feel like people. So for the general fan, it probably doesn't matter. For people who are really, really into it, I feel like they should know.
Yeah, like me getting one of the words wrong, it's good to correct me for the record.
Sure, I'll be sure to let you know. But I don't want to make it seem to people who are new to the scene, so to speak, that like they have to understand every difference. Like, don't worry about that too much. But that said, for I guess it would be like for fantasy fans. I had a good analogy on the tip of my tongue. Give me 1 second. Let me think. Okay. So maybe a good analogy. This is not the perfect analogy, but at least kind of will impart what I'm thinking. If you are a fan of fantasy, you would know that Harry Potter is basically young adult, right? And then something along the lines of Malazan is going to be like epic fantasy. So if you went and called Malazan young adult fantasy, people would be like, "What? That's not young adult." And if you said Harry Potter is a typical example of an epic fantasy novel, similarly, people who are familiar with the genre would kind of probably raise an eyebrow at least. And so that's kind of what it is with xianxia and suanhuan. Now, the characters that make up the two are kind of important. I don't think the characters for suanhuan are as important. The specific characters for xianxia are important. Xian, character for immortal, and xia is basically the character for hero, although the exact meaning of what xia is pretty complicated. Maybe you talked about it on the Wuxia podcast. I listened to a bit of it, by the way, not the whole thing. But there's a lot of background information on what is xia and stuff. But
my favorite version is Wandering Knight, I think, or Knight Errant. I think that sounds quite cool in English.
Yeah, I mean, so I've thought about doing a video on this personally because I'm actually not really a fan of translating xia as Knight Errant, but I know that's a pretty popular way that some people like to refer to it. But
it's the rule of cool that I like it. It's not because it's accurate. I just like the English phrase. It sounds cool to me.
Yeah, it does sound cool, and it encapsulates a lot of it. But the problem is, it doesn't make any sense when you convert it into xianxia. So I don't, at least in my personal opinion, I think that just using hero works well enough because it wouldn't make any sense to call the people, the characters in xianxia novels, immortal knight errants. It just doesn't make sense.
Yes.
But the point is, they're novels about immortals and people who try to reach that extremely high level of power. The main difference between the two is that, if you want to simplify it, xianxia is purely Chinese. It's really a Chinese genre, and the foundation is Chinese mythology, Chinese religion, Chinese philosophy, with
geography
hints
as
of
well.
Other things like Buddhism and Hinduism are found in there as well. But for the most part, it's purely Chinese. The character names are going to be Chinese, and the cultures represented are, for the most part, going to be Chinese. When you get into suanhuan, it's oftentimes a lot more influenced by Western stuff. So with suanhuan, sometimes even the character names will be Western names. The Chinese writers will use Western names for the characters. A typical example of that is Coiling Dragon, which, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, one of the novels that sort of kicked off this whole thing. In that novel, the majority of the characters, as far as I understand, all of the characters have actual Western names, and you'll have a lot more Western influences. The novel series I'm translating now, Sage Monarch, is definitely suanhuan as opposed to xianxia. It has ninjas, it has mechas, it has time travel, it has what I would essentially call like gnomes, like Dungeons and Dragons gnomes, except they're like technologically advanced and have a mechanical civilization. So a lot of stuff that you wouldn't see in Chinese mythology and whatnot. And so that's kind of the main difference. But like I said, they're often conflated even in China. So in the news in China, it's similar to how maybe science fiction and fantasy isn't the best genre because that's pretty mainstream in the West. But let's say maybe like comic books or anime maybe or something like that. The fans are going to know, but the general media probably doesn't have a deep understanding of it. And it's the same in China. Even in China, Xuanhuan and xianxia will be conflated and mixed up and whatnot. So I'll revert to what I said earlier. I don't think it's super important to know the difference.
Do you know in the Xuanhuan novels, in the original Chinese, if a character has an English name, will it be rendered in the Chinese characters, or would it be a little bit like when you see a alphabetical word set inside the characters? So would it be Christopher or Kelisa Tufo? Do you know?
The latter. They transliterate it.
Right.
But it's like you said, if you see Kelisa Tufo, you know that it's Christopher, the Western name. You're not going to mistake it for a Chinese name.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I was going to say, this one's not a question, but when you were talking about a xian, an immortal, there's quite an interesting explanation of it in a different context in another episode of this podcast, and I'm really speaking to the listeners here. I had a guest on, Brian Holton, who is he's the translator of Yang Lian, the poet, and he's of particular interest to me because he does Chinese to Scots. But anyway, the concept of a xian came up, and he was talking about how in like older school literary translation or just common practice, it would get translated as fairy, and he thought that was quite a silly mistranslation. And then he gave his explanation to me of what a xian immortal is. It's a person, so it's a human being who has transcended in some way, and they've in like the classic Chinese culture, they've done that by doing something like going up to the mountains, practicing meditation, eating only, what was it he said, pine cones or something. But I'm guessing in xianxia, it's maybe a little bit more exciting than that, the way that they cultivate themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, number one, I definitely agree about the fairy thing. I've seen fairy a lot, and I just hate it like 99% of the time. It's just super silly. And in terms of, I mean, everything you just mentioned seems spot on from what I understand. And the novels usually emulate that as well. The immortals in the novels usually start out as mortal, as human, and then by means of some process, they become an immortal. But you're right, the process is obviously a lot more dramatic and exciting. Usually it involves tribulations from heaven. Tribulation is usually the way it's translated. In other words, the idea in most of the novels is that this process of becoming an immortal is actually a defiance of the natural order of things. It's a defiance of heaven. So heaven will usually, what exactly heaven is depends on the author and the universe that the author is creating. Sometimes heaven can just be like just an impersonal force of nature. Sometimes heaven or the heavens are actually controlled by a group of people or whatever. So it depends. But one of the big tropes of the genre is the tribulation, which usually involves lightning falling from the sky, but it could be other things. And that lightning is an attempt to essentially destroy this person who is trying to rise up to become an immortal. And only those who pass that tribulation and show themselves to be, powerful enough to defy heaven, to defy the natural order of things, will eventually reach that level of becoming an immortal. And, I'm trying to enunciate these words very clearly because in the end, the actual Chinese character for this immortal being does not have anything to do with immortality or long life or anything like that. It's a unfortunate misconception, I think. And I have a whole video about this on my YouTube channel. But basically, these immortal beings are not immortal in the sense of being incapable of dying or being able to live forever. Another key aspect of the novels is longevity. And most of the time, as you rise up through the ranks of the cultivation system, and again, I'll point out that usually the immortal level will be kind of low on that list. Usually what happens is the person's longevity increases with each higher level that they attain. And usually the immortals in the novels are not people who live forever. They might live for 1,000 years or 10,000 years or something like that. But eventually they'll run out of their longevity and they'll die, or they can be killed in battle, obviously, as well. So it's not as though they are impervious to damage. So in the end, the Chinese character itself is not about long life. The version that most people see has the character for a person next to the character for a mountain. And so that's
Right.
one reason why that whole mountain thing is a lot of times mentioned in the etymology and when people are explaining what the immortals are. And I've seen the mountain connection used in the novels a lot as part of the sort of, flowery description, or even a technical, actual specific part of the cultivation process. For example, in one of the most popular ones I did, I Shall Seal the Heavens, that immortal level is literally about a person and a mountain. So when they become immortal, each person will summon their own specific unique mountain with its own size and shape and functions, and they will stand on that mountain and rise up into the sky and batter the door of immortality to open it. And if they can force that door to open and step through it, then they become an immortal. So yeah.
One thing I kind of had not drilled into me, but I seem to recall from doing my undergrad degree in English literature, an idea that occurred fairly often is that in Western Enlightenment, especially in like Enlightenment thinking and literature, there's an idea of like going against nature, revolting against the heavens, man trying to empower himself against the ways of nature. And it's always being told this is a Western thing, it's in the Western context. And the implication is there, if it's from a different culture, they won't be doing this kind of perversion against nature. Well, maybe perversion is a loaded term, but going against nature for your own kind of lust for life. So it's interesting to hear you describing something that fits that description that I've heard quite a lot in my time as a student or as a learner of literature, but it's not in the Western context. It's the Chinese context. The thing I have a really quite limited knowledge of Chinese literature, but the one thing it reminds me of is the part of Journey to the West where the Monkey King's rebelling against heaven. Do you think there's that's a root to any of this, or is it just just the same sort of plot being used?
I mean, I do think that has a lot to do with it, and I myself and I think many others have pointed to Journey to the West as sort of being the original xianxia novel, and maybe that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but definitely a progenitor. When I've seen people, online and in podcasts and videos and whatever, claiming that xianxia is like this brand new genre and then it came out of Wuxia, I totally disagree with that. And again, I'm not a scholar, but going back to Journey of the West, many, many, many xianxia tropes are directly from it, or at least they're the same. The alchemy, concocting pills, defying heaven, the monsters, demons, and whatnot. It's all very, very xianxia. So I definitely think that there's a strong connection between those two. And something I wanted to elaborate on, you mentioning, the Western themes that you just talked about. I think that there's a big misconception when it comes to Chinese culture and ancient Chinese culture and this kind of spiritual side of things, because a lot of people in the West think of Eastern stuff, and let's just say Chinese specifically, and they're thinking of like Taoism and Buddhism, and they envision monks meditating and tapping on bells, or sitting in caves and whatnot. And it's not that is untrue, but that is a vast simplification, I think, of what Chinese culture is about. I saw this all the time when I was a teacher, and this goes beyond fiction and beyond religion, just Chinese culture in general. I think a lot of average Westerners who haven't done much research, when they think of China, they think of people drinking tea, doing Tai Chi, and monks, and pagodas and the Great Wall and picturesque scenery and whatnot. And when I was working in China as the head teacher, I would often I would recruit teachers, and there would inevitably be a major culture shock when they came over and realized that all of that spiritual side is basically a tiny fraction of what Chinese culture is about. So working that background into the novels, again, as I was mentioning, it being a defiance of heaven, it's a very, the way that these worlds are described, according to the authors that I've seen, this world of cultivation in which people are pursuing immortality, they're not pursuing immortality. Well, okay, let me back up. They are pursuing immortality as part of the general scheme of things, and as part of their pursuit of the path of becoming an immortal. When I first got into the novels, I was thinking, these definitely should be these old monks, these with super long white beards sitting on top of a mountain, humming, and they're at one with nature. But that's not the cultivation world in the novels. Cultivation world in the novels is survival of the fittest. The strong eat or destroy the weak. survival of the fittest. It's basically really, really brutal. People are competing for a very small set of resources that they need to reach those higher levels of power, whether that's the spiritual energy at the lower levels or some type of special stone or rock or cultivation technique or whatever it is. There's intense, brutal competition, and you have to look out for the self. So it's actually very self-based, and people have to be willing to kill others in order to be able to survive. They just have to. One of my other series that I translated, the name of the series is A Will Eternal. The main character of the novel hates fighting and hates killing, and he's a coward and doesn't want to die. But as part of his journey, he comes to realize that if he doesn't stick up for himself, if he doesn't fight to defend his friends and to defend himself and to kill the people who are trying to kill him, then he will die and he will lose his life, and all of the things that he's scared of will come true. So in the end, he has to fight and he has to kill to be able to survive. And I think that's a common theme in a lot of the novels, actually.
Going back to Journey to the West, so I've only seen one version of it all the way through. It was one of the film adaptations. And the thing that struck me is this Sun Wukong, this Monkey King guy, he's a wee nasty bastard. He's a horrible little shit, and he's not even especially clever. And yet he's the character that he's not just like a very strong sort of Marvel hero sort of guy. He's insanely overpowered. He's a bit like Superman in that he just can't really lose a fight unless he's been nerfed in some way. And that reminded me of... So I've never read a modern xianxia novel, but I've always been struck by like the people talking about them, talking about how strong and how elevated these characters can be, and that they can be like in a heaven above the heavens. And like you said, the kind of power level that the level Immortal is sitting at doesn't even have to be very high up the scale. And what that reminds me of is kind of like this is going to be an anecdote from my childhood. So when I was a wee kid in the UK, we had 5 TV channels, unless you were spoiled and your parents bought you a satellite dish and you had Sky. And if you were a kid, the best thing about Sky is that it had Cartoon Network. So whenever I was at a spoiled friend's house, the first thing I'd want to do if they didn't have a PlayStation would be, let's watch Cartoon Network. And one of the shows I really wanted to see when I was sitting down in front of my friend's Cartoon Network channel would be Dragon Ball Z, because I'd never seen anything like it. And I've since learned that owes a bit of an inspiration debt to The Monkey King and Journey to the West for various reasons. But it's the same deal. So I'd seen like kid shows before, like Spider-Man, where there's a hero who's about as strong as everyone else, but he's still just a man. He certainly can't fly through the sky, shoot energy beams. His strength doesn't get described by a power level, which is a quantifiable number. It's just completely mind-bending. So this doesn't go anywhere, but it's just interesting that I'm so primed to understand what you're talking about when you start talking about characters cultivating themselves in these xianxia novels, if that makes any sense at all.
I mean, it absolutely does. And interestingly enough, I actually have a Dragon Ball hat sitting here on my table, which I often wear. So, but yeah, I mean, Dragon Ball Z and whatever iteration you want to talk about is a really good analogy. I think that the levels of power that you see in Dragon Ball is akin to maybe the level of an Immortal in these novels, maybe a little less, because the power levels do get insane. I mean, eventually it'll reach the point where they can create worlds, create what are essentially galaxies or even universes, and their attacks are, able to destroy realities. I mean, it's extremely mind-bending. And in terms of the genre in general, I know that there are a lot of TV shows that are pretty popular, and there are some animated shows that are pretty popular. I don't think any of the xianxia TV shows and animated shows really can properly convey what is involved in that kind of power level. Quick question: did you watch I forget. I'm gonna blank on the specific name, but there was a Journey to the West movie that came out something like 5 years ago, kind of a comedy. It was called Journey to the West: Subduing the Demons or something along those lines. Did you happen to see that?
There is the one I saw would have been maybe about 4 or 5 years ago now.
And there's a scene where Monkey King Sun Wukong transforms, becomes like this gigantic monkey, and then there's like a Buddha that's bigger than a planet, reaches down to try to crush him. That is definitely the sort of stuff that you get in that you're going to see in the xianxia novel is, you know, gigantic planet-sized creatures. And incidentally, that scene from that movie was a direct ripoff from another TV show, which I don't want to get into that topic. But point is, it does appear in movies and media sometimes, but I don't think very many places are going to accurately capture that. And it really makes sense when you read the novels. The novels are about the journey, usually of one person, but, you know, a lot of times their friends and family will be secondary characters. And it's really about their journey from essentially being a mortal to being not just an immortal, but to being a god, or even like the god, although it doesn't necessarily equate to the Western idea, but essentially the ultimate, most powerful being or entity in existence. And it's about that journey. And so I think that's also one of the reasons why the genre became so popular, because it does things that Western fantasy usually doesn't really do. I mean, I've read a lot of fantasy. I haven't read everything, but these novels definitely go to a level that you don't find that often in Western writing.
Yeah, I've not read a huge amount of Western fantasy. The only thing I can think of that rings a bell is, it's a very strange thing. When I was a teenager, when I was early into my teenage years, my dad bought me the Lord of the Rings books, and I tried to read them, but I couldn't really get into them. I think I was maybe a bit young. But then years later, without having read them, with only having seen the films, my stepdad my stepdad happened to have a copy of the Silmarillion, and I read that from start to finish. And that starts off with like a creation myth, and you learn that there's a god who made some other lesser gods who then made the immortal elves, and then, you know, so it proceeds down to humans. But it's not really the focus of the story, and it's written, from what I remember, it's more written like a Bible book. Like, there's not much character development or dialogue. It's just a description of things that happen. I feel like if you had those demigod characters fighting, maybe that would be like a xianxia. But yeah, like you said, it's definitely not something you'd associate with books coming from English language authors or even European language authors. None that I can think of, except maybe like Lovecraft.
You could always check out, so my translation that I mentioned earlier, A Will Eternal, if you read the last, basically, I'd have to check, I'm pretty sure last 15 chapters, you could actually read it without really knowing anything about the novel and sort of get a sense of the higher levels of power, because he ends up, it's almost like the beginning of Silmarillion, except it's the end, and he's the one that's doing all that stuff. So the main character eventually reaches an extreme level of power, and he essentially has to rebuild the entire universe that he lives in. And it describes the process, essentially like the process of evolution, except he guides it, and he gives people fire, and he tells them how to, he gives them language, and he teaches them how to practice cultivation to reach a higher level. And then there's a kind of, it's not intended to be funny, but sort of funny considering we were just talking about it. There's a certain point during this process, after thousands or millions of years, I forget, where he has a revelation and he realizes that he forgot to add heavenly tribulation in, and people were becoming immortals too easily. So then he adds a tribulation, and then all of a sudden it's not as easy. And anyway, I would recommend checking that out just to kind of get a foundation for the sorts of power skills that get involved.
Right, and last question before we actually talk about the non-xianxia book we're here to talk about. Have you read any of the 3 Body trilogy books?
So it's funny you mentioned that. I have and I haven't. The answer is I have. When I lived in China for many years without ever coming back to the US. And when I did finally make my first trip back to visit, bringing my wife and my child with me to visit, my parents, my kids' grandparents, I actually bought the entire trilogy to give to my dad because he's a lifelong sci-fi fan. And I always have intended to read it, and I've always wanted to read it. It's just that I haven't had the time. And another thing is that because I do this full time, it's not something I do on the side, an hour here, hour there. I am full time translating Chinese stuff all the time. I kind of don't really want to read Chinese stuff on my spare time because I'm doing it constantly. And so I did end up reading a bit of 3 Body Problem. I read the first couple chapters in English, and then I realized that I want to read it in Chinese. And so my intention is to read it in Chinese, but again, I have the problem of not really wanting to read Chinese because I read so much. So it's been kind of sitting there in the back of my mind, waiting for one of these days when I have a vacation or something and I'm not translating all day, every day, I'm going to read it in Chinese as opposed to the translation.
Well, I'm not working as hard as you on that, but I know what you mean, because I try to read so much translated Chinese stuff for this podcast that whenever I read something not translated, it feels like I'm giving myself a treat, which is stupid because I love reading the translated Chinese stuff. But anyway, the reason I brought that up is there is like a officially stamped with Liu Cixin's seal of approval fan sequel, like a fourth book on the end of the trilogy, and it goes to some of like the universe creation, mind bending stuff that we were talking about, but in the context of science fiction and in the context of that trilogy that the guy was writing his fanfic for. And he originally posted it online as like a Chinese web novel. So now that you've taught me so much about xianxia, it makes it easier for me to see what that author Bao Shu was doing with that fourth book in the context of like online Chinese web genre fiction. But yeah,
well, I'll have to add that to my reading list as well then.
Totally. It is good, but you have to read the trilogy first. So
yeah,
no rush.
I will.
Yeah. Anyway, we really should get to our book for this episode, and that is 7 Killers, and our author is Gulong. Although before we actually talk about the story, I just want to ask you one thing about how did you... Yeah, first thing I want to ask is, how did this translation of 7 Killers by Gulong come about?
Well, like I mentioned in my origin story, I wanted to read and I wanted to force myself to read, so I picked Wuxia, and I wanted something short, so I picked the shortest thing I could find. The thing about Gulong is his writing style is not particularly complex. He is a lot easier to read than, for instance, Jin Yong. I don't know too much about Liang Yusheng. I know he's really popular. I haven't read much of his stuff in either English or Chinese. But the main reason I picked Gulong was my understanding at the time was that his writing was easier to understand and the book was short. That's literally the only reason why. But as I go back and look at it, like I tweeted yesterday that I was rereading it in preparation for this podcast. I forgot how much I like his writing I'm actually more happy with the translation than I thought I would be. I haven't read it for quite a few years, so going back to read it, I found some mistakes and some things I probably want to tweak, but overall I'm pretty proud of it, and I just really like his writing style. He's just so I want to say like visceral, and what's the word I'm looking for? And basically like cinematic. I think his reading his stuff is like watching a movie on the page, I guess is the way to say it. And
totally.
So those are the main reasons why I ended up with Gulong as my first major project.
Right. And the reason I was looking for the kind of origin story of how you got that one onto the web is I want to ask you about the readership, because I was looking at the comments underneath the different chapters of 7 Killers, and people weren't really saying Gulong this, Gulong that. They were saying the author this, the author that. And I was wondering if they know if he's an author from, who was writing decades ago, who's since passed away. There was one commenter who was commenting on like some of the romantic or even like sexual stuff going on and saying, gosh, this author must be a virgin, which is kind of ironic after you read a little bit about the life Gulong lived. So do you know what your readers are seeing when they see your translations?
You read it on Wuxia World, right?
Yes.
Okay. So when I originally posted it, like I said, I posted it on SPCnet. So I haven't gone back there for a long time. But if you went back there, I suspect the comments would be a little bit different, because the readers on SPCnet definitely were aware of who the various authors are and whatnot. SPCnet is the kind of place where you can go and, you'll find forum threads, people debating who are the top martial artists in Jin Yong's world, who are the top martial artists in Gulong's world. And then if the top martial artist from Jin Yong's world fought the top martial artist from Gulong's world, who would win? Like that kind of stuff. And so,
right.
But then Wuxia World, very, very, very different. The fandom on Wuxia World came for the Cultivation Novels. And for the most part, they're a lot younger, is my impression, and don't know very much, if anything, about the stuff they're reading. And yeah, it's funny because just last night when I tweeted about this, somebody responded like, I'd have to pull up the tweet. I don't have it in front of me, but it responded something along the lines of, I have read a lot of, manhua lately, and this looks like a very interesting light novel in reference to Seven Killers. So I basically responded. I was like, it's not a light novel. This is a classic wuxia novel that came out in the 70s.
Listen, actually,
I tried to I tried to make it, as informative as possible, not be a jerk about it. Basically, I was like, no, it's not a light novel. And I think, to answer your question, the readers, they don't know who the authors are if they're reading it on Wuxia World. And on top of that, and in the most respectful way possible, I have to point out that the vast majority of readers on Wuxia World, especially back when I put Seven Killers on there, because you have to realize I put Seven Killers on there, I basically just copied it over way in the early days of Wuxia World. A lot of them have absolutely no understanding of Chinese culture, or at least a very little bit. That's one of the reasons why I started my YouTube channel, was because I wanted to explain a lot of this stuff, because a lot of the comments where people are making fun of that kind of stuff, for instance, the one you just mentioned, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that these novels are very, very Chinese, and the interactions, the dialogue, the way people react and act is extremely Chinese. And if you don't understand the culture, it is going to come across to you as being odd or strange. I have a whole video talking about this. I have a couple videos talking about the matter of face, and that's one of the biggest criticisms I see are the readers saying, "Oh, this isn't realistic. The characters are too dramatic. They're too sensitive. They're too easily offended, or blah 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 blah." But the thing is, it's not unrealistic. It's actually very realistic if you understand how face works in Chinese culture. And so I think that's another factor that plays into it.
Yes. I've also lived in China. I've also learned, sometimes the hard way, about face. So, yeah. But yeah, it is. It's like, kind of like, I don't know. I don't put too much faith in analogies, but like, it's if you have a problem or a puzzle, and it makes or a code, it only makes sense once you have the key or the missing part. And then once you know what's going on beneath the surface, then all the kind of actions that are motivated by face make perfect sense. But if you're missing that one key component and there's no footnote telling you what it is, then it could be a bit mystifying.
Yeah, I mean, I have a video called it, I think I called it "Why Face is More Important Than Reality" in Chinese fantasy novels, and by extension, to some extent, Chinese culture in general. And it's just, I've seen it with my own eyes over and over again, where people will make decisions based on face that seem to be obviously the wrong decision, or at least incomprehensible. But when you are part of the culture for long enough, it does make sense. And so anyway, yeah, that's again why I did my YouTube channel to begin with, is because I'm hoping to kind of spread more awareness of that, because it makes the novels more enjoyable. Even when I first started reading the novels or watching the movies, I was often laughing at the story, at the characters, because I thought it was so stupid and unrealistic. And now going back, I realize, it was just my own sort of ignorance.
Yeah, you've actually reminded me of something I was going to mention much earlier, when you mentioned kind of an what's the word, like an instigating moment for you in becoming interested in Chinese things was the arrival of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which is a film that came up in my last episode as well with Gigi Chang, and it was probably my first exposure to wuxia or kung fu stuff. So on one hand, I was going to say something like, gosh, this must have been a really big moment of cultural exchange or cultural awareness in the West. But I also think back to when I was a kid, I watched that film. A year or two later, I watched House of Flying Daggers. And if you'd asked me at the time, are these stories set in China or Japan, I would have said, yes, it's China and Japan. So I wouldn't even have known it was Chinese.
It's funny you mentioned that, because same here. In fact, I distinctly remember when I went to see Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon in theaters. And then just a couple of days later, I went over to a friend's house, pretty good friend. They were a married couple. And the husband was like, "Oh yeah, I saw the trailer for that. It looks so cool. I definitely want to see it." And then his wife said something like, "Oh yeah, I really love Japanese movies." And then he turned to her and he was like, "What?" He's like, "Are you kidding me? It's not Japanese, it's Chinese." And she was like, "How do you know?" He's like, "Well, just look at the names of the characters. It's obvious they're Chinese." But externally, I was just kind of nodding and being like, "Yeah, But inside, I was like, wait a second, you can tell the difference between Japanese and Chinese by the names? I didn't even know. So that shows you how ignorant I was.
Yeah, I think like also these things can register, but you don't process them. I remember watching the end credits of some like Hero, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and thinking, gosh, these names are all very short. Chinese names must be very short. And then completing Mario Kart on my Game Boy Advance, and then noticing that, well, I knew they were Japanese names because it's Nintendo, and noticing, oh, most of these names are very long. Japanese names must be very long. So registering that the difference, but never actually internalizing anything deeper than that, just remembering it when I happen to see them. But yeah, we seem to have become sidetracked again. So I'll ask you about the author again, Gulong. He's often referred to as one of the three tripods, or one of the three tripod legs of Wuxia. So obviously that means there's him, and there's two other authors. I think you've already mentioned them. So what makes him so good? What qualifies him as one of these three legs? And what makes him stand out from the other two legs?
Well, I don't want to claim to be a scholar of this kind of stuff, and there's a lot of stuff you can read online about it. I would say probably more so in Chinese than in English, and I have read some of it, not all of it. I'm pretty sure there was a biography of Gulong that came out just a couple years ago, and I have not had a chance to read it. The only things that I have to say are things that I have heard and read in like little articles here and there, and kind of just based on what I understand of their writing style. I think that one thing has to do with the time period they're writing in. I'm going to assume you've probably read or at least heard of the novel Paper Swordsman. That goes into this really exhaustive study of that kind of stuff in the time period and whatnot. And some of it is he became popular and was extremely prolific. And then another thing is his style is very different. So like I mentioned before, I feel that his style is a lot more visceral, it's a lot more cinematic, it's a lot more dramatic. And I think that, in fact, I had a comment, somebody made a comment in one of my YouTube videos. They commented I'm remembering it in Chinese. Yeah, it was in Chinese. So a Chinese person commented on one of my videos. I did a recommendation video where I recommended my top 5 traditional Wuxia novels. And I think 3 of them were Gulong, 2 of them were Jinyong. Like I mentioned, I haven't really read Liang Yusheng, so I can't recommend his stuff at the moment. But basically, this person in Chinese said something. Now, I can't confirm that this is a common saying. They claimed it was. They said that among Wuxia fans, they say that Jin Yong writes novels and Gulong writes Wuxia. That's what they said. And
interesting.
So again, I can't verify how common of a phrase that is or whatever, but I thought that was very interesting because definitely their stuff is extremely different. I like both of them. There are some Jin Yong stuff that I really, really love. Now, one of the differences is I've never read Jin Yong in Chinese. The Chinese level is too high. At least it was when I tried to read it a few years ago. I suppose my Chinese level is probably higher now. So, one of these days, one of my dreams is to read his stuff in Chinese. I never have, but I have read a ton of it translated into English. And his stuff is very well written. It's very historical. And especially his fights are very different. I think one of the biggest differences are the fight scenes, because in Jin Yong's stuff, he gets really descriptive into the fights. And it's very interesting, like he'll describe the movements of the hands and every single move and what it does and its trajectory and what it looks like and all of this stuff. There's even a fight scene that I remember in the name of the English translation. I think it's called Fox Volant of Snowy Mountain. I think you can get that still on Amazon. But I'm pretty sure there's a fight scene that lasts for 2 chapters. It may be just 1, but it's like really long fight scene and it's very cool. Gulong, very, very different. His fight scenes will usually last for 1 move or something like that. It'll involve some kind of dramatic tension, some dialogue or something maybe, and then the 2 masters make their move, and when 2 masters clash, one will come out alive. General kind of feeling, almost like sort of like samurai chambara movies where the samurais face off and then whoosh, and then one of them's dead kind of thing. So yeah, I think that his Gulong style itself is also probably one of the big reasons why he ended up being so popular.
Yeah, this was going to be one of my questions a little bit further down, but it's probably a good idea to raise it now. So from what I could find, there's a pretty limited amount of information about Gulong in English online. And one of the best ones is actually, it's from I think it's My Chinese Books, which despite the English name is a French site. Or it's in the French language, and it's all about Chinese literature. But by the magic of Google Translate, and by the relatively close proximity of English and French, so that auto-translate works quite well, I was able to read this whole web page about Gulong. And there was a thing on this page saying, some readers have been known to say it's very easy to die in a Gulong written world. You can die in one move. And the reason for you being killed can be really minor. You can be killed off stage, so to speak, quite easily. And there was an influence given. They actually named a specific Japanese author of samurai stories, Eiji Yoshikawa. And I have his name in Japanese here, and I can read it using Mandarin pronunciations from the characters, just to flex. Jichuan Yingzhi. So apparently Jichuan Yingzhi in Japanese is Eiji Yoshikawa. I know nothing about him, but supposedly that's how his fight scenes worked, and that's an influence I think Gulong cited for like this one-hit kill world of fighting. I don't have a question there, so I'll just charge on.
Well, I just want to jump in real quickly and say, yeah. I mean, like I just said, I think his is a more sort of brutal, but I don't want to necessarily say brutal, but a very, yeah, I guess you could say one hit sort of thing. I'm not too familiar with the Japanese author you mentioned. I did.
Me neither.
Yeah, so I can't comment on it, but that is definitely the feeling I get. And so interestingly, I don't want to get off the rails too much, but I co-authored a tabletop role-playing game, like basically Dungeons and Dragons, that was heavily inspired by Gulong's Wuxia fiction and other authors as well. Not only him, but to a large extent him. And this is supposed to be coming out later this year in October. So it's unreleased yet, but that is how we designed our world to emulate that. So instead of being like Dungeons and Dragons, where you can have a fight that goes on and on for many, many rounds, and the characters are sort of like slowly losing their hit points, in our game, it's supposed to be like Gulong's world. You actually only have a couple hit points. And even if you're a very high level character with high martial arts, if something hits you hard enough, you will die. And so we intended for our fight scenes in this game to last for between 1 to 3 rounds maximum. And so that was a direct inspiration was the stuff from Gulong and also the stuff that you see in the movies. Although the movies, especially the old 70s Shaw Brothers stuff and even modern stuff, they're supposed to be action movies, so they tend to draw out the fight scenes a lot more, even when they're adapting Gulong works. But yeah, we did try to emulate that in this game that we made. So yeah, it's a very relevant point that you just made.
Yeah, another thing I'm thinking of like a world of one-hit kills is the Western, the American Wild West Western, because one bullet and you're at least knocked down. And I think you'd said before on Twitter, you'd noticed that there are some parallels between some kinds of wuxia, including Gulong's and spaghetti westerns in particular. And although nothing particular was springing to mind as I was reading the 3 chapters of 7 Killers that I did read, they kind of like vigilante, no one's strictly a good guy or a bad guy, lots of double crossings, lots of twists, hunting for treasure. That was reminding me of the fairly limited number of spaghetti western films I've seen. Do you have much to say about that? Or do you have anything to say about that?
I mean, yeah, I totally agree. I think that spaghetti westerns are the closest that you get to, especially Gulong style wuxia. I have questions about this because, like I mentioned, I'm not an expert, and I don't have the time or energy to track down Gulong books and interviews and whatnot. But I am curious how much cross influence there was. I do know that Gulong was influenced by Western stuff. I've seen things floating around saying, he was influenced by certain Western authors. And I've tried to confirm that in Chinese, but again, I haven't done extensive research, so I'm not sure. I'm very curious how much cinematic influence crossover there was because, the spaghetti westerns were coming out. Many of them were coming around at a similar time to when wuxia movies were popular. Gulong was alive and writing in the 70s and I think the early 80s as well. So I'm curious to see how much crossover there was. One of his later more, I think, relatively famous novels, which you can find translated on Wuxia World, not by me, but by actually the owner of Wuxia World. The English title is Horizon Bright Moon Saber, and there is a 70s version of that novel, a movie version, and they took some liberties with a few different things. And one of them is that the main character basically wears a poncho like the the Clint Eastwood nameless gunfighter guy. It looks almost exactly the same, and his sword, he actually like twirls it and then latches it onto his hip, just like you would see in a spaghetti western flipping their revolver and putting it on their hips. That was a direct, obvious crossover, and of course that was on the movie side, so I don't know how much it goes onto the literature side, but there are definitely a lot of crossovers. I was just watching, just a couple weeks ago, I watched Once Upon a Time in the West, and the first something like, I want to say 10 or 15 minutes of that movie really reminded me, not in any specific sequence of events, but it really reminded me of the opening part of Seven Killers, because in the opening part of Seven Killers, it's so, I don't know what the right word is, but you know how it focuses on the guy's hat, like what's underneath the hat, and then what is his expression and what is he looking at, and it's like, I can envision these spaghetti westerns where it's like it's focusing on their eyes, and then like sweat dripping down their head, and then the hand kind of like twitching toward their gun. Definitely super wuxia in my opinion.
Yeah, like a saloon. I guess, I don't know how much, I'm sure that's kind of a trope in classic westerns as well as spaghetti westerns, where there's tension is building and building and building, someone's got their hand under the table, and then it all explodes. If I can flex my film studies education for a sec, a thing I did in my second year of my literature degree was, film studies modules, and one of them was on film genre, and that's maybe one of the best film studies modules I did, because one of the genres we looked at film noir, and we looked at the western, and something film noir and the western have in common is that they had a very long and strong, actually the film noir didn't have such a long and strong golden era, but westerns had a really long golden age. Film noir had like a peak of like a classic, kind of a straightforward film noir style film. But then when both the genres started to go out of fashion, a kind of more extreme, cynical, self-aware version came. So in the case of film noirs, the very last film noirs that were made knew they were film noirs rather than accidentally being in that style, and became more deranged, more dark, more violent. And in the case of the Western, I suppose it was a bit more of a long, slow demise. So spaghetti westerns, these anti-westerns came about, and rather than becoming crazier accidentally, they were kind of like a flipping or a subversion of like the black and white morals of the old films. So they're kind of, both of those things were playing a bit of a game. They knew that they were playing with the genre. They were kind of meta stories. And I know that Gulong in his writing was actively trying to do something different with wuxia. He was trying to innovate. But like, as I was reading Seven Killers, I was thinking, damn, he just keeps, there's so many things where he sets you up to think something. Like, he introduces you to several big heroes at the start of the story, and then they're all killed off stage, and you realize they've been killed off stage because you're presented with their hands, and then you find out that a guy you think is a nice hero is actually a bit of a morally grey scumbag, and thing. Even just in those 3 opening chapters, things twisted so many times. So I wonder if you have an opinion. Is he playing like a meta game? Is he messing with the story format, or do you think he was just trying to write something cool?
I wouldn't be surprised if it was a bit of both. I mean,
yeah,
like in the I haven't experienced this firsthand, but I've talked the novel I talked about, Horizon Bright Moon Saber. I've talked about this a lot with the guy that I co-authored that game with that I mentioned, and we have a podcast in which we discuss wuxia movies. He discusses the wuxia movies constantly, but me and him do it in the context of this game, and we talked about this movie and this novel. According to him, Gulong specifically was, had specific character trope goals or subversion of certain goals in that novel. That's just that novel. I don't know about Seven Killers, but I do think that it's intentional. I mean, he wasn't just writing fun stories, and I gotta point out that if you only got up to chapter 3 of Seven Killers, then you currently have no idea what's actually going on in the story. You got to read the whole thing, at all. Because the way you just described his character, it may or may not be true. I probably kind of spoiled it by just saying that. But the point is that he sets up a lot of stuff that gets subverted, and you realize later on that you have no idea what's going on. And even after reading it one time, you probably are going to be like, wait a second, what was going on? And then you got to go back and read it again to kind of, if you really want to sort of piece together the puzzle pieces. So I have no idea what he went through in his writing process for this novel, but there's no way that he just made it up as he went along. He definitely had a master plan here. And in terms of kind of turning things upside down the way that you might expect in the genre itself, I would be inclined to think, yeah, he probably was trying to do that.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that I had no idea what the actual scheme behind the scheme was.
Yeah.
But I would keep reading for sure. I was hooked. Speaking a little bit more about what Gulong was like as a person, we hinted before it was a bit ironic that someone was thinking he might be a virgin, because he had a little bit of he was married so many times. He was clearly had a bit of a womanizing problem. He also had an alcohol problem, and that kind of did him in the end. And I noticed that xianxia, who, I mean, I assume, I don't know, he appeared to be the main character of the story for most of the 3 chapters I read. This guy, it's his capacity for alcohol, like how much booze he likes to drink and how much he can take, got brought up a lot. And he does some womanizing again in these 3 chapters I read, and he doesn't really seem to suffer the consequences that Gulong did. I guess the question here is a fairly obvious one. Do you think that xianxia is kind of an author insert for Gulong here, like an idealized version? Not trying to say anything too mean about the author, but I just wonder if you have a perspective there.
I would say, I don't know, maybe not, because the way he's portrayed is actually, I think, supposed to be the typical kind of jianghu wuxia, like, badass, let's say, because a lot of Gulong's characters are like this. There's a novel, and you know, the heavy drinking, it's not just him, like that sort of drinking thing goes back in Chinese literature a long time. Go back to Water Margin and Romance of the Three Kingdoms or whatever, you're going to find the same kind of thing. So it's not as though it was necessarily unique to him. Not to harp on the game too much, but we brought in a drinking element to the game and made alcohol tolerance an actual mechanic within the game because of how much it comes up in his novels. And, you know, I know we're not talking about role-playing games, but because of the popularity of Drunken Master, the Jackie Chan movie, a lot of people who are interested in Chinese action, let's say Chinese action movies, because there's a big difference between Kung Fu movies and Wuxia movies, but let's just say Chinese action movies. I think because of the popularity of Drunken Master 2, there's this huge perception that like drunken boxing is like this big thing in Chinese martial arts and Chinese culture. I'm not saying it isn't, but that's not like the typical representation of how drinking works. In whether it's Gulong or even in Jinyoung novels as well, it's definitely not common for the xia, the heroes, to be getting super drunk. In fact, it's more likely that they can drink a whole lot and not actually be drunk. And maybe, you know, you could psychoanalyze that whatever way that you want, but in the end, I think the main character of Seven Killers is more supposed to be a representation of that sort of like stereotype or trope. And I do have to point out that there's a lot more going on to the story than you might realize, and I don't want to get too much into spoilers, but the way that he's presenting himself in those first several chapters, okay, fine, spoilers, a lot of it is more of an act than you realize, basically. So anyway, I think that for better or for worse, that sort of heavy drinking, I wouldn't necessarily say womanizing is one of the things that's what's the word I'm looking for? Romanticized. I don't necessarily think that womanizing itself is romanticized in the novels, but the drinking definitely is, for sure.
Okay, good answer. I think that was all my questions I had there about Seven Killers. Is there anything? I feel like we've only scratched the surface of it as a story, given how in depth we got into other general genre things. I'll think of another question on the fly here. What do you think's the coolest thing about Seven Killers, or what are some things that you like about it, just personally?
So as I get older, I am less and less interested in action and fighting. especially when it comes to the wuxia stuff, whether it's the movies or the novels. I'm more interested in the characters, the story, and the dialogue and whatnot. In fact, when I watch a lot of wuxia movies nowadays, for the instance, for the other podcasts I do, I tend to fast forward through a lot of the fight scenes, to be honest, because I've seen so many and they don't particularly interest me. It's funny because I've seen people on Twitter say things like, wuxia is really good for the fight scenes and choreography, but that's about it, or something along those lines. And I'm like, what? For me, it's like the opposite of that. And this novel is definitely like that. For example, in the first, let's see, 3 chapters, there isn't really any fight scene per se. I mean, there's a couple clashes and there's some people that get killed. Like you mentioned, a bunch of people get killed off screen. There's another fight scene where he gets beat up that happens off screen. So really, the action elements are not part of it. I really like the interesting and unique characters. I love the dialogue. His dialogue is so hilarious, where people will be going back and forth, almost like quipping back and forth. And then there's always some twist in the dialogue. And I was reading more of it this morning and I was just laughing, not at it, but just laughing because I feel like it's so interesting and cool to hear these super powerful guys talking back and forth. And, they'll say it'll be something like, there's always, he takes care with his dialogue. So it's hard. I don't think I could make it up on the fly, but it'll be something like, I came here to kill you. And then he'll be like, well, did you come here to kill me or to be killed? Well, I came here not to be, I can't even do it, but it's so snappy and fun and interesting. I think that's one of the highlights of reading his stuff.
Yeah, it's quite braggadocious. I got the feeling in the bits I read, the characters were like testing each other or trying to get one over on each other as they were talking, in often like a humorous way.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, for sure. In fact, okay, this is the last time I'm going to bring up the game, but we basically included that in the game as well because we wanted to emulate less of the, back and forth combat and more of the drama. And so we actually included a section where the characters are supposed to engage in this kind of banter dialogue thing. And again, this is not just a Seven Killers thing. A lot of his novels are like that, where you have these witty back and forth conversations, a lot of times involving wordplay, but in a way that usually is easy to convey in the translation in English. Not always, but usually.
Yeah. I suppose that's something, this is totally going on a cliche, but did you ever play a video game called Monkey Island?
That, my friend, is one of my major influences as a young kid. I played Monkey Island 1, 2, 3. I forget how many there were. Yeah, I definitely played those. And you're talking about the sword fighting insult part?
Yeah. Sword fighting entirely powered by insults, like swashbuckle banter. So again, I was talking about the experience of how, what Dragon Ball Z reached me growing up in Scotland. The Monkey Island games did reach us over in the UK, but I think the first time was someone made one of the swashbuckling scenes into a Flash game online. So I saw that as a teenager, and then years later they made someone made the Monkey Island games into apps on the iTunes store, and my wee brother bought the first one, then the second one, then the third one. Then I was constantly nicking the what were they called? An iTouch? It's been so long, but yeah, whatever that Apple device was, I was nicking his iTouch so I could play Monkey Island.
Yeah, I was raised on those kind of games, so definitely that whole insult sword fighting thing I loved that part. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess in this Gulong story, it's more like people trade insults and then they do their 1 or 2 hit fight, and then one of them falls over dead or gets incapacitated.
I think the underlying sort of idea behind it is that they're trying to sort of intimidate or, to gain an advantage by intimidating their opponent or something along those lines, because he, I think, is definitely has a style of fighting where some of it is psychological. In fact, I know that because in the one of the novels I translated, Heroes Shed No Tears, there's a whole part where basically one of the 2 main characters, I would say there's 2, maybe 3 or 4. Anyway, one of the main characters, the good guy, is set to go into this duel. And the duel is against the top hero, or let's just say the top fighter of the age. But it's questionable as to who's going to win because this main character is actually very, very, very good. And so the advisor to this great hero essentially creates this entire manipulated scenario of psychological warfare to cause this main character to have a stunning emotional blow that gets him off of his game, basically. And so because of that, he goes into the fight distraught, distracted, depressed, basically. And then because of that, well, he doesn't lose because somebody saves him, but he definitely doesn't win. And I think the implication was that psychological warfare worked out perfectly. So I think that for Gulong, a lot of the fighting and the lead up to the fighting is psychological. And that's more important than the actual moves of going back and forth with the swords or the, kung fu or whatever.
The only sport I was ever particularly good at a competitive level was tennis. And there was two or three summers when I would go around with the other kids from my tennis team to other tennis courts in the Tayside and Angus region of Scotland, and we'd take on other teenagers from other teams. And my psychological warfare tactic was just being really polite and never showing any frustration and smiling. And sometimes the other player would be equally polite and it would all be fine. Other times they would want to do like the aggression psych outs, and the best counter I found was just a friendly smile every time you won a point, and then they'd get even more off their game.
Yep.
So I think we've kind of exhausted talking about Seven Killers, given that I did only read an opening portion. So now I'd like to get technical, since you are, after all, a translator. So let's talk about the very first piece of translation one does, the title. Well, maybe this wasn't the first thing you did, but a very first order thing is finding an English title from the Chinese title. So your English title is Seven Killers, which sounds, I have to say, like it's a really snappy, modern sounding title from a story that's from quite a few decades ago, from a very different language. So what is the Chinese title, and how literal is your English translated version of it?
Well, this is a complicated topic. In terms of Seven Killers, not so complicated, because it was a pretty simple and direct forward translation. When I was originally reading the novel and then going into translating it, I looked online to see what people were calling it, because a lot of the translations of a lot of his novels, even if they're not translated, have had the titles translated, or their movies. I don't think there's any movie of this, but when I was doing my research, everybody was calling it Seven Assassins. But when you read, because shashou, in Chinese it's qi shashou, shashou is often translated as assassin, and so I think that's a fair translation if you don't know what the story's about and it sounds cool. But when you read the story, it's obvious the reference is not to any kind of assassins. Basically, the antagonist has 7 fugitives, basically, that are working for her as guards, and they're not assassins, they're basically just killers, and so there's 7 killers. Now, later on I came to the realization that there could be some more complexity to this, because qi sha is also its own word, and now that I think about it, I'm wondering if there's maybe some more wordplay in there that I missed, but I don't think so, because the story is fairly straightforward in terms of the setup, and the setup is the main character, Liu Changjie, having to deal with, as part of his heist, these 7 dangerous people who are killers. Now, in terms of other titles, sometimes it's not so easy, because, you have to translate Chinese characters into English grammar sometimes. For instance, one of my later translations I ended up calling Dragon King with 7 stars. But in Chinese, it's Qi Xing Long Wang, which is literally 7 stars Dragon King. And so it could be, 7-star Dragon King. I ended up switching it to Dragon King with 7 stars because there is a sort of wordplay explanation for why it's called that later on in the novel. And in subsequent things that I translated, a lot of times it's very difficult to translate the title. For instance, with the Cultivation Novels, well, we really shouldn't be calling them novels. When I say we, I just mean in general, because they're not novels, they're series. I mean, like 1,600 chapters, 1,500 chapters are definitely series, not really novels. But anyway, the point is that
it's ironic people call them light novels, given how huge they are.
They're huge. So in any case, there are oftentimes wordplay explanations for the titles that you'll find later, deeper on. And so with those, sometimes it can be very difficult to translate them. There's a lot of the titles right now that are pretty popular, maybe even still being translated, where the translators started working on them before the novels were complete. And so the actual translations of the series is basically wrong, because they didn't really know what the explanation was when they started translating it. So in those situations, it's hard. I think for Seven Killers, I happened to just get it pretty easy because it was a short novel. I was able to read the whole thing before translating it, and the explanation was pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm. Now, a minute ago, I said there was something I'd forgotten. I wanted to mention, but I'd forgotten what it was. But it's such a... I don't know if listeners will find this interesting, but I really want to share this. Did you ever watch Lost?
Yes, I watched the whole thing. Although I can't claim to remember every single detail, but yes, I did watch it.
Yeah, so I've introduced my girlfriend to it, and she's hooked, and we're powering through it. And I'm noticing the odd thing I didn't notice before, having watched it all at least once. I noticed a pattern in the dialogue. I don't know whether it's intentional or if one of the writers just had this tendency, but there'll often be a thing where one character is trying to get another character to do something, and they'll usually pull it off by they'll give like a list of reasons or a description of a situation, and then they'll say, and that's why you're gonna blah blah blah, Jack. So like, I know that you couldn't keep your marriage together with your wife, and I know that you're a wretch, and that's why you're gonna push that button, Jack. That was the formula. And with some kinds of film or literature, if it's trying to be, I don't know, literary, then repetition like that is a bad thing. But I feel like a magic of genre fiction or genre TV is the pattern's part of the fun. So the reason I'm bringing this up is when we were talking about, you were trying to describe the pattern of Gulong's dialogue. It's not because it's bad, it's because it's part of the fun that you've got this pattern that you, the reader, can kind of recognize and enjoy. So yeah, I wanted to get that off my chest because it's literally something I noticed, described to my girlfriend, and she was like, oh yeah, that's nice, but we're in lockdown, so there's no one else to tell.
That's interesting. I can't say that I noticed that in Lost, but it definitely makes sense. And yeah, I think your assessment of it is right. And the cool thing is about that dialogue stuff is that sometimes in the movie versions of these novels, a lot of things get changed, but they sometimes will almost directly lift the dialogue. So you can kind of see that stuff get played out by the actors. And I think that adds another level of fun to it.
Yeah, but getting back to translation, I'm sorry about that self-indulgent thread. By the way, if you do rewatch any Lost, just watch out for a character saying, and that's why you're going to blah, 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 because you won't be able to unhear it now that you know. But
I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah. I want to ask you if Gulong is an easy writer to translate compared with other writers whose stories that you've worked to translate.
I would say yes. I've never translated Jin Yong, but like I mentioned before, when I tried to read it, it was a little bit too complicated. One of the things that's very nice about him, I don't know the process that he went through in his writing in terms of the editing, rewriting, and proofreading. But there's definitely a difference between a writer writing a novel to write a novel as opposed to the web fiction things where a huge factor is the number of characters that go into it. In other words, the authors of the web novels, they have to meet a quota per chapter in order to get paid a certain amount. Generally, 3,000 Chinese characters from my understanding to get the normal pay for their chapters. And what that leads to is a lot of stream of consciousness writing, a lot of extra padding and filler. And in the case of the series I'm writing now, the author, I can't guarantee it, but I would bet money that there are many parts that I could identify where he basically wrote his chapter, was short, several hundred characters. So he went back and was like, oh, I'll just add some details here. And he throws in stuff that has literally nothing to do with the flow of the narrative, and so it breaks up the flow of the narrative, but he does it because he has to add the content. That in itself, that element makes the web translation much, much harder. At least for me, if I turned my mind off and just translated it directly, I could do that, but I can't make myself do that. So
it's the conscience getting in the way.
What?
Your literary conscience holding you back.
Yeah, it's just I can't make myself do it. So I edit the novels significantly. I don't change any of the content or I don't change what happens, but I remove the unnecessary filler and I tweak things to make it a little bit better. For Gulong, I didn't really have to do that at all. Now that I think about it, going back and reading it these past couple of days, I realized that there are some stiff parts to the translation and whatnot, but what is on the page is very, very accurate to his writing style and what he wrote. And so because of that, I would say definitely easier to translate his stuff. And another element that made it a little bit easier is because he relies so much on the characters, the character growth, the character interaction, the drama and the poetic descriptions and stuff, and not on intricate wordplay or philosophical elements. That makes it a lot easier to translate too. With the xianxia cultivation stuff, a lot of the authors throw in, Taoist, the quotes from like real Taoist texts, real Buddhist texts, real poems and different things like that. And then they'll link that in wordplay to the techniques. And that makes it very challenging to translate. And, again, Gulong doesn't have those elements as much. So I definitely think he's a little bit easier to translate in terms of general difficulty. And so for anybody out there that is starting to get into this language learning thing, and if they're interested in being a translator, I definitely would recommend, finding one of his books that is untranslated. There are still a lot of them out there. It's definitely a great place to start in terms of reading and also trying your hand out at translating.
That's reminded me, actually, when I was first looking at a Bao Shu's fan fiction sequel to Three Body Problem. So the English title it has now is The Redemption of Time. But I believe that's actually the second English title it's had. The first English title was a translation of the Chinese one, because the Chinese one has nothing to do with Redemption of Time. The first English title it had was Era of Contemplation, but a literal translation from Chinese would have been like Contemplating the Universe. And if I remember correctly, even that's not quite perfectly saying what the original Chinese title was saying, because the contemplating part, I think it was Guanxian or Guanxiang or something, which was like a Buddhist term, like some sort of Buddhist inflected reflection or contemplation, which you would really need some cultural knowledge to know as well as just the language knowledge. And like I was saying, that book that book started out as a web novel. So again, another parallel between that sci-fi book and from what you've told me about xianxia novels. So that's really interesting.
Just going to point out that because of the way the web novel, specifically like Qidian.com is obviously the biggest publishing platform, they let anybody put anything on there. So you will find fan fictions of just about anything from Naruto to World of Warcraft. And if it's good enough and people like it and they start upvoting it and whatnot, then it can become, quote unquote mainstream sort of. And so that's interesting that, Three Body Problem. When you originally mentioned it, I was guessing that that's what it was, and it seemed to me that that's the case. So it has good sides and bad sides. The good side, I guess, being that there's the potential to have some great content. I mean, I heard there's an unofficial Harry Potter follow up, I think, that people have talked to me about, which I never checked out. I don't know how that was originally published, but anyways, again, I'm kind of veering off topic here.
The Harry Potter one is in Chinese on Qidian.
No, I'm talking. No, sorry. I see. I'm kind of jumping around from topic to topic. There's an English version, unofficial Harry Potter follow up, but I don't know because there's web fiction, in the West as well nowadays on Wattpad and Royal Road and whatever other websites. But I'm not sure where originally this Harry Potter spinoff was from. But I did a video on my channel where I basically binge read Harry Potter over the course of a couple months for the first time, and then did a video about it. And I had a couple people mention this follow-up and how good it was and whatnot.
Oh yeah, I could, I haven't read an awful lot of Western web fiction, but I definitely know enough to do a podcast episode on it, because it's a crazy, strange world. But yeah, what you were saying about there being lots of different fanfics out there, and it being not too surprising there's Three Body sequels. I'm pretty sure it was in the afterword, in the edition I read, the English edition, where Bao Shu wrote about his experience of writing this sequel, because he was in Belgium at the time studying. He was at university in Belgium when Death's End, the third and final installation of Three Body, came out, and his friend scanned all the paid. Was it scans or photos? I don't know, but his friend either photographed or scanned all the pages and sent it but as images or PDFs to Bao Shu, and then he proceeded to read this massive book extremely quickly. And I think he says in the afterword he knew that if he wanted his fanfic sequel to go anywhere and not vanish, he had to be the first out the gate and first published. So as well as it being good, writing a really good fan fiction sequel wouldn't be good enough. He needed it to get it out there before all the other ones. Because even if it was the best one, if it was the 10th one to be published, it would just vanish. Because inevitably, there would be so many Three Body sequels, because Three Body was so popular in China. So one reason we're able to read that in English is because he knew there was going to be competition. So he just operated at lightning speed to be
makes
first
sense.
out the gate. Yeah, but let's get back to Seven Killers. I've got my last question here about translation. Were there any particularly interesting linguistic problems you hit upon while you were trying to translate it? Anything that required a little bit of problem solving or creative thinking? Yeah,
I mean, and if you go through and read it, this was my first translation, so I was very meticulous about it, and I noted all of those things. So if I deviated at all from the Chinese, whether it was on the level of an idiom or something, then I put a footnote and explained it. And it's been years, and I haven't gone through to reread it in terms of your question, so I don't think I can come up with anything off the top of my head, except I do remember there was an expression in the first chapter, and I actually have the first chapter in Chinese, but it would take me it would be too hard for me to track down the specific part. But there was an expression that made really perfect sense in Chinese. Again, this is off the top of my head, and I haven't thought about this for years, but in Chinese it said something along the lines of these guys were going to go up the stairs, but the implication was if they stepped on the stairs, then they stepped on the stairs, but if they kept walking, then they were going to die. And in Chinese it was a weird expression, something if they had a bowl of rice, there was already half of a fish in the bowl of rice. It was something really weird. I can't remember. And I ended up translating that something along the lines of they already had one foot in the grave, or something along those lines.
Right.
There were a few things like that. And over the years, now I've translated millions of Chinese characters of content. That's obviously something I come across and have to deal with on a daily basis. And it just depends on, for me nowadays, it depends on the situation. Nowadays, I actually do like to translate the idioms directly if they can make sense. I've done some polls of readers on this subject, and the vast majority of readers, at least in my readership, they actually like to have a direct translation instead of the interpretation, as long as it sort of makes sense. Instead of saying it was as hard to find as a needle in a haystack, the direct translation would be, it was as hard to find as one hair on 9 oxen. Mm-hmm. You get the idea based on the direct translation, and a lot of people really like to have that sort of direct, insight into what the Chinese language is like. But I would say in this translation, that was the hardest thing I had to deal with, was the idioms and the expressions that don't come across when translated directly, and then trying to figure out how. The second thing was, and I noted this in the footnote, the main character, Liu Xianxia, has a female, there's a female character that he interacts with, and they have a couple different conversations where there's some really heavy, culturally contextual wordplay, and that was really hard to get right. And if I remember correctly, I took some liberties with that, and then put the direct translation into footnotes. It's really hard to make the decision when you're translating, at least in my opinion. It's hard to decide which side to lean on. Do you lean on being more accurate, but then the reader doesn't understand? Or do you lean on being less accurate, but the reader understands it more easily? That's the line that the translators have to kind of walk, no matter which way they go.
Right. Yeah. The one that stuck in my mind, and I only know about this because you footnoted it. It was a case where a particular kind of shoe, I think it was being described, and the only word shoes. Tabby, yeah. So we have the word for it in English, and it's a loan word from Japanese, and the same kind of shoe is existent in China, and there's a Chinese word for it, but the word reached us from Japanese, so it makes sense to put the Japanese word into the translation of Chinese, as strange as that might seem.
Yeah, plus if I remember correctly, that part is in a poem. So if it was a character that, if it was in Chinese and it basically said he pulled on his tabby socks, I might say he pulled on his socks, which had, one big toe and an adjoining 4-toe opening. I don't know. I might
Yeah.
instead of using tabi, describe it or something. But you can't really do that in a poem. So you are
you
pretty
get
much forced to use
poetic
the Japanese
license.
or something that nobody's going to recognize.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay, I think we've been talking quite a long time here, so we can probably move on to the section that I dub Miscellaneous Questions. So in every episode, we have an institution, the word of the day. So I wonder, could you pick out a particularly appropriate word of the day for the listeners, and then we can, then we can teach them it if they don't already know it.
So I'm going to go with the word. It is a very simple word, but I think it requires some sort of commentary. And that is the word jiu. So jiu is the word for alcohol. We talked about it quite a bit throughout the conversation. Gulong was very much an alcoholic. And, in Chinese culture, that's not as much of a negative thing. A lot of people are heavy drinkers and it's not really generally looked down upon. And his characters tend to be heavy drinkers as well. Now, the thing is that jiu is oftentimes translated as wine. So this was my first translation, and I did translate it as wine in Seven Killers. Later on in my translating career, I have veered away from using the word wine for jiu because the reason being that, especially for the average Western reader, wine has a very specific connotation, that being grape wine. And grape wine is not something that people in China would drink historically. It's more popular nowadays.
Yeah.
I have a whole video about this on YouTube, by the way, but the point is just that jiu will oftentimes be referring to hard liquor, not necessarily any kind of wine. Now, if you want to talk historically speaking, throughout most of Chinese history, the common beverage to drink in terms of alcohol would be yellow wine, which is not grape wine, but it is similar in that it's something like 20% alcohol.
Huangjiu,
but
right?
What Gulong liked to drink was not that. He was a baijiu drinker. So
right.
Baijiu is the character for white and then the character for alcohol. Now, sadly, some translators will translate that as white wine, but it is anything but white wine.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to drink a wine glass of it.
No, so I talk about this in the video on YouTube. It's hard to say unless it's specifically stated what he envisioned his characters to be drinking. But there are occasions when he actually names the type of alcohol they are drinking. Sometimes it's not baijiu, but sometimes it is. And so in the end of this little speech, I'm going to say that I usually translate jiu as alcohol because I think it's more accurate as opposed to wine, which could be accurate or could maybe not be accurate depending on what specific beverage they are consuming. So that's my word for the day, jiu, which is alcohol or wine, depending on how you want to translate it.
And I've definitely had some baijiu that was almost just pure alcohol. It's pretty rough stuff, some of it.
Oh yeah, I mean, my father-in-law, so my wife is Chinese, my father-in-law is Chinese, and he is a big baijiu drinker. I mean, as far as I know, he drinks baijiu for lunch and dinner every single day, maybe sometimes for breakfast. I'm not really sure. But there are good types and there are bad types. And I have had the bad types, and I have gotten hungover on the bad types to the point where I think maybe it was alcohol poisoning. I'm not really sure. And that is not fun. But there are expensive versions and good versions that are actually very, very good if you can develop the taste for them. But yeah, if you're unfamiliar with it and you go to China and you try the, arguato, like red and blue and white bottle or something along those lines, it's probably not going to be a fun experience your first time around.
Yeah, I played that prank when my parents visited me in China. It was a fun one. What you were saying about the mistranslation of Joe, that I have two fairly good anecdotes from my first year in China about that. One's based on real life experiences I had. Another was based on watching TV in China. So the real life one was so I was working for this wee school in a small town in Zhejiang province, and I would be brought along with the Chinese staff for like the monthly or maybe it was quarterly staff meals. And the drinks on the table would be there'd be coconut milk for the non-booze drinkers. There would be red wine, like grape wine. There would be baijiu, and then maybe some beer. But your alcoholic choices were so red wine and baijiu. So you can see the disaster waiting to happen here for like the newbie in China and the Chinese English teachers who had a very good command of English, but maybe not the exposure to Western drinking culture, so that when they were asking me, do you want some red wine or white wine? And I said, just one time for variety, I was like, white wine, please. And then it gets served in a little shot glass. And I'm like, what's this? And then, a few weeks later, when you find out what baijiu is, it all makes sense. And
yeah, that sounds like a familiar story. In my case, I made the mistake. So, getting into the culture and the language with the background of Wuxia kind of hanging over me, I made it a point to learn a lot of alcohol related language, drinking language and idioms and whatnot. And there's since you were in China, you know that ganbei basically means to drain your glass.
Yes.
And so there's a really common expression. Now, I do not recommend this to anybody who is not a very experienced drinker. And even if you are an experienced drinker, you got to be very careful about using this in China. So one of the expressions I learned that I would use a lot is 我干了你随意. So 我干了 means I will ganbei, I will finish my glass. 你随意 means you do whatever you want. And the implication is I will finish my glass, but you don't need to finish your glass. And the implication is because you're not as good of a drinker as me. And so when you use that on Chinese guys that are drinking baijiu, it's a borderline insult. And they'll like, they don't get mad, but they take it as a challenge to like, oh really? So you, the foreigner, can outdrink me, and then it's on. And so you have to be very careful.
Yeah, the PE teachers at that school were a bit like that. And some of the parents who came along for the meals, they were weirdly aggressive, some of the dads. The second anecdote I had, this one is almost more amusing. It was watching the CCTV, like the Chinese state broadcaster, has a lot of channels. And at least when I was there, they had one that was called CCTV English, I think. And it was like a 24-hour, or was it 24-hour? It was like a constant news channel, but it was like their international one. So you got some really interesting, strange niche reporting. But a lot of it was done by seemingly like semi-professional reporters. There was a lot of strange stilted language, so it was really interesting viewing. But like I said, there was lots of interesting things that you just wouldn't get on a more normal news channel. One of them was they had some wine growers on who were either growing in China or selling for the Chinese market, and there was a little bit of a nice non-political report about like the habits in China, drinking the newly rich middle class buying more red wine, drinking more red wine, and so on. And it was all pretty normal. And then like near the end, the host of the show asked one of their foreign guests. She started a question by saying, "There are lots of stories in the old Chinese poets' classics of sharing a cup of wine together. Do you think your wine imports can bring back this culture of drinking wine?" And it's like, well, obviously, like, Li Bai wasn't drinking red wine made from grapes. But the poor guest probably didn't even know what to make of the question, regardless of how schooled she was on the classics. So she was like, well, maybe. And then that was the end of the program.
I can only imagine. That sounds awesome.
Yeah. I hope it's on YouTube somewhere. Probably not. It'll be in their archive somewhere. On to the next question, which is weirdly on the same theme. If 7 Killers was a drink, what drink would it be? And I guess would it be, if it's not baijiu, is it huangjiu? If it's not huangjiu, is it baijiu?
I mean, I would say in honor of Gulong, definitely baijiu, and especially because it's such a short and sort of like wham bam thank you ma'am novel. He has some long series of novels with recurring characters, but this is almost a novelette, I think, and it's hard and hot, just like a shot of baijiu. So definitely baijiu. The only question would be which brand. I know that Gulong had his favorite brands, but for me personally, the one that I've gotten used to the most is Luzhou, which is what my father-in-law would drink a lot. So by extension, me, and I've kind of gotten used to it. And so yeah, that's what I would say a nice healthy portion of Luzhou brand baijiu.
It occurred to me just right now. So Gulong was born in Hong Kong and then moved to Taiwan, I think, when he was a teenager. Do you know if there are any Taiwanese baijius?
Oh yeah, I'm sure there are. I'm not very familiar with them, but there definitely are. I mean, anywhere that there's Chinese people, I think there's going to eventually be some kind of homegrown baijiu. I mean, even the place where I lived in China was not exactly a huge city, and it had multiple different local baijius. And my father-in-law, managed to track down people brewing baijiu in the Maotai is basically the most famous expensive brand, but it comes from a region in China which is famous for baijiu, and they'll have different versions of Maotai. And so he found one brewed by people with the same surname as him, the family surname. So anyway, I can't say for certain what they are, but I would imagine that there are definitely brands of Taiwanese and Hong Kong baijiu.
Well, I guess here's a place for the listeners to reach out. If you guys are screaming the answer into your your smartphone devices or into the air, listen to the links and whatnot I give you in the plugs, and you can reach out to myself and Jeremy and school us in Taiwanese baijiu.
I would love to know what the Taiwanese baijiu is.
Yes. So speaking of that, are you working on anything right now that you'd like to self-promo? It might perhaps be a tabletop game or anything else you can point the listeners towards.
Yeah, I think that's probably what I'd like to mention the most, because it's most relevant to this discussion. As I mentioned, me and Brendan from Bedrock Games have been working on this game for about 2 years now, and it's published by Osprey Games, so it's a legit big game publisher. And the source book at this point, I'm not certain, because they can kind of tweak things with the page layout, but it's going to be something around like 250 pages, something along those lines. It has a bunch of original art that we all not directed, but me and Brendan, he's more of a aficionado of the movies, and I have the translating and culture background. We have something like 40 illustrations, beautiful art by a very experienced artist named Kagan McLeod. And it comes with a built-in adventure module. And we didn't get too much I didn't mention this before, but we were talking earlier about how Gulong likes to subvert the expectations of the audience, have twists and turns. The built-in adventure module that we have, it tries to emulate that by putting the characters into an escort situation. So the escort job is a big Wuxia trope, where they're supposed to take an important thing from destination A to from location A to destination B, and then twists and turns happen along the way. So again, that's coming out in October from Osprey Games. It's currently available for pre-order on Amazon right now, and also barnesandnoble.com, and I think wherever you can buy books online, for the most part, it's already there. So the name is Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades. And yeah, check it out on Amazon. Order it for pre-sale before you forget, and then you'll get it as soon as it comes out. And in terms of my other translations, if you go to my website, which is jeremybai.com, JEREMYBAI.com, I have links there to all of my works, including Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, the game, and then all of the translations that I've mentioned, and even some that I didn't mention. They're all there in either links or downloads that you can get on my website.
And you've mentioned your YouTube a few times. I mean, I'm sure we can find that pretty easily via your website or by sticking Jeremy Bai or Deathblade into YouTube. Is there anything the listeners should know about that, or do they know everything they need to know?
Just youtube.com/Deathblade is the channel, and I have the main type of video I do talks about Chinese fantasy novels, Wuxia, xianxia. I have something like about 50 videos addressing all sorts of different topics. I talk about Chinese culture a little bit here and there as well. So youtube.com/Deathblade, all sorts of resources there for people who are interested in getting into it and sort of understanding some of the more difficult aspects culturally or language-wise.
Yeah, that's something I should do. I went through a phase, I think it was towards the end of uni, so I would have been about 21, where I would, usually I'd be playing some silly game on my laptop or even back home on the old family Xbox. But I would have all the sound from the game turned off, and I'd be listening to some very enlightening, like a university lecture or an explainer or something just off the audio on YouTube. And then I resurrected that hobby recently.
Yeah, mine is basically talking head stuff, so it's definitely good for that.
Yeah, I resurrected the hobby recently because I got I don't know what you'd call one of these, like a YouTube client that can it's got a button and it can play only the audio of any video, no problem. So I was bringing that habit back and learning lots of things in my downtime, and then the app stopped working. God damn it! So I need to find a replacement.
Well, what can you do?
Yeah, I will find a replacement for sure. But yeah, that's our miscellaneous questions. So now let's point the listeners to maybe some further reading. You've told them where they can read your translated wuxia and stuff. But if they just want to get into wuxia, reading wuxia specifically online, I think we've had a few pointers peppered throughout the episode. But where's like a really good first stop where they could go looking for this stuff?
Well, you have basically two options, which is looking for official licensed professional translations. That's going to be, you don't have much to pick from, to be honest. If you go to my website and you kind of click around, I have a link to an Amazon storefront I created in which I basically compiled all of the professional licensed wuxia translations that I recommend in one location. So if you are able to do some sleuthing, go to my website, find my Amazon storefront, and you can find them. Otherwise, you can just simply go to Amazon and type in wuxia novel and start clicking around and try to find them. There are not very many. There's basically The Deer and the Cauldron, The Book and the Sword, 11. Those are by Jin Yong, but he did them under a pseudonym of Louis Cha, or that's his English name or whatever. The Condor Heroes translation is currently being released. I have mixed feelings about the Condor Heroes translation, but that is an official licensed translation. There are also some Gulong novels such as The 11th Sun that you can get on Amazon, Foxville Under the Snowy Mountain. That's pretty much it as far as I'm aware of. So if you want to go expand beyond that, then your best bet is to go to the spcnet.tv forums that I mentioned earlier. If you go down to the Wuxia Translations subforum, the top pinned post is actually by me from several years ago. I kind of want to update it or actually remove it because I haven't been active on that forum for a really long time, but it's still there and it has links to numerous completed fan translations of Jin Yong and Gulong books. So until somebody gets around to licensing them and translating them officially, that's going to be the best bet to enjoy some of those works.
Cool. Do you know an author called Tang Chi?
It doesn't ring a bell.
Because I think, I don't know if this is a modern work of wuxia or something older, but one of Amazon Crossing's translated Chinese books is some sort of a wuxia book. It's called To the Sky Kingdom.
Yeah, no, you're right. I have heard about that, but I don't know too much about it.
Yeah, I do know.
I have heard about it, yeah.
Yeah, the translator is Poppy Toland, I believe, I've done one of the stories she's translated on the show before, which is a very different sort of story. It's an avant-garde, like literary novella sort of thing called Flock of Brown Birds, and the language that was rendered in was absolutely beautiful. I mean, I suppose a wuxia novel is a totally different kettle of fish, but I'd imagine if Amazon Crossing have got their hands on it, they seem to be fairly competent, and from what I gather, she's a great translator. So that's one.
Yeah, I know the translation you're talking about with the flock of birds or whatever. I'm pretty sure. If that's the one I'm thinking about, I have read that, but I haven't read this other one that you mentioned.
Yeah. So I was just, when you said Amazon, I think that's where my little Amazon Crossing knowledge part of my brain lit up. But anyway, next question I have for you, and the last question actually, is what are you reading just now?
Well, it's actually funny you ask. I am in the middle of reading The Witcher. I have read, let's see, there's like 2 prequel books and then the main trilogy you can get. And then now I'm on to book 4 of the primary trilogy. So I guess that means I'm 6 books in. I watched the show and I really liked it. And then my brother picked up the game. He's a big gamer and he really liked the game. And so I kind of was interested in seeing what the actual story was all about. So for the past couple months, that's what I've been reading. And like I mentioned before, there are Chinese things that I need to read, but I just can't make myself sit down and read them after translating and working for 8 or 9 hours a day, 6 days a week on that stuff.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would blame you. Is The Witcher book good?
Yeah, it's really good. There are certain things about it that I don't necessarily love, but overall, it's great. It's been a long time since I've read kind of a good, just, epic fantasy, sword and sorcery fantasy kind of thing. that's what I really loved back when I was the most voracious reader in high school. And so it's fun to get back into something that has, you know, swords and elves and wizards and sorcerers and whatnot. It's really fun, but at the same time, it's a lot more mature than some of the more lighthearted stuff that I think I read as a younger one. So nowadays I enjoy maybe even more than I would have back then. So I would definitely recommend it to anybody who hasn't, even if you haven't read even if you haven't watched the show or played the game. I mean, those two things, the game and the show, came from the books to begin with. So definitely go back to the source. It's really, really well translated because I'm not sure if you were aware, it's originally not an English language novel or series. Very well translated and really a good read.
Yeah, is it from somewhere in the Slavic world? Is that...
Yeah, it's originally in Polish, is my understanding.
Right, cool. And what you were saying about being the most voracious reader when you were a teen. So when I finished my undergrad degree, I was thinking a lot of people in my year groups kind of way of thinking was fantastic. We can read for fun again. We can go back to being just hedonistic readers, reading for the joy of reading. And years on, I realized, well, to some extent, yes, but to some extent, that innocence is lost forever. Now I'm podcasting about books, and most of the books I'm reading are just going in the bank. They're being deposited into the future podcast episode bank, which is fun. But the dream of getting the innocence of reading without any self-awareness of the bigger picture of things, I think it is just a dream of lost innocence for me now. I don't know how you feel.
Well, for me, maybe even more so. You know, I'm getting up there in years. I'm married. I have a 4-year-old, and I have another little one on the way. And so even when I do have a chance to sit down, it's like, if I'm sitting down and reading, there's always something on the back of my mind, you know, whether it's, oh man, in 40 minutes, it's going to be shower time for the 4-year-old, or, you know, in a month, we're going to have another crying mouth to feed, all those different things. It's hard to kind of sit down and just enjoy a novel when there's always something on the back of your mind. But I do manage it somehow. Like I said, I've gotten through almost 6 Witcher books in the past few months. So a little bit here, a little bit there. I'm making some progress.
Yeah, well, I guess what we can both make a mission for ourselves to do is cultivate our immortality, distort time so we can unlock more time to cultivate our minds through books, and that should help mitigate these problems.
There you go. I'm all in for that.
Absolutely. And on that note, I guess I should say thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for literally teaching me lots of interesting things, and hopefully giving the listeners lots to think about, lots of entry points to Wuxia, which, like you kind of described, is a tricky thing to get into when a lot of, like, just in terms of word count, what's out there is on sites that will be unfamiliar to most people. And your storefront list of the traditionally published stuff that's a really good idea, and I'll make sure I've got a link to that in my show notes. But yes, what I'm trying to say is thanks, and it's been great talking, and sometime down the line you're always welcome back on the show if you wished for that.
Well, yeah, thank you. And I'd love to be back. And I'm more than happy to, you know, I don't want to get too sappy, but I'm just all about spreading the love for Wuxia and xianxia and these novels. And I think that they're great. And I hope that more people over the years come to enjoy them. And that's why I did my YouTube channel. That's why I have the resources on my website, because whether it's my stuff or other people's stuff, there's just so much great content out there. And I hope that anyone who has listened all the way to this point will take some time to kind of dig around and find what interests them. Because regardless of whether you're interested in action or adventure or romance, there is stuff out there that will interest you. Whether it's Wuxia or xianxia, there's stuff out there for you. So I hope that this can be an impetus for some people to make the leap and start poking around and find what they like.
Hell yeah. What I can tell you is even a lot of the top translators of, like, traditional Chinese to English publishing, they've asked me, like, what is this Wuxia stuff? Are you going to do an episode on it? We have no idea. So, and they comprise a significant slice of the listeners. So you'll be reaching them, and that, who knows, if you can set them down that path, that really could create some cross-fertilization between, like, the nerd culture and the forums and the high ivory towers. If the two things can combine, nothing can stand in their way, I think.
Sure. Well, if I can bring the message to more people, you know, the more the better. I feel like the xianxia stuff is sort of like the, Barsoom or Tarzan or Conan. of the Chinese, entertainment field. Back in the day, all of that Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff was kind of looked down on, and over the years it's come to have a little bit of a different flavor for the fan of literature and fiction. So I think that the more people who are able to get into, or at least sample, the cultivation stuff will definitely be in for something interesting. And same for Wuxia. I mean, Wuxia is even more mainstream nowadays than it's ever been. So definitely something to check out. So again, thanks for having me, and I do hope to be on again someday.
Awesome. So one more big thank you to Deathblade, aka Jeremy, for having such an enlightening chat with me. I learned a very great deal over a pretty short amount of time, and I had fun too, so what more could you ask? Now, there's nothing left to do but get on with the plugs and then say goodbye. So first thing I'm going to plug are the ways that you can support the show materially and maybe get some bonus content in return. So all the bonus content is up on Patreon. If you give pretty much any monthly contribution, you get access to all of the bonus shows, and we had a pretty cool one I just posted yesterday which fans of Chinese sci-fi will enjoy. It's like a run-through of Ken Liu's Invisible Planets anthology, and I'll just give you my thoughts on all the stories and the essays contained within. It was a pretty fun one to record, and I think the patrons liked it, so that's there. If you, like me, are terrified by the concept of money coming out of your bank account monthly, and therefore, in theory, until you die, and that being a number multiplier that just strikes fear in your heart, there's also a way you can give a one-off contribution, and that's on buymeacoffee.com. You don't get any bonus content though, so you'll have to weigh that one up in your mental and moral and emotional and financial calculus. But anyway, both of those sites are just patreon.com and buymeacoffee.com, and then on the end of the URL /Trchfic, TRCHFIC. That's them. Another fun place you can go, which is totally money free for you and for me, is Discord. If you don't know what Discord is, it's a place where, the Church of Vic Discord is a place where fans of the show can join, chat to me and each other, and I have like different channels in the Discord set up. So like there's one chat which is devoted to Wuxia, there's another which is devoted to sci-fi. I make a new channel for every episode, so all sorts of fun things in there. That's free, and the link to the Discord invite will be in the show notes and also in the Linktree link that I have at the top of my Twitter and the top of my Instagram. Speaking of which, if you want to find those and you don't know where they are, the show's Twitter is my own one. It's just at Angus Likes Words. The show has its own Instagram account. It's at Trchfic, TRCHFIC. Those are fun places. Fun places? I don't know. That's subjective. They are useful places to get in touch with me. If you'd like to give any feedback on the show, if you think me or Deathblade got anything wrong, or we missed anything, or if you'd like to educate us about Baijiu from Taiwan, that's a good place to do it. He's on Twitter too, of course. Now, the last wee thing, I've already talked about this on the show, but Podbean is the podcast's new host. We're on Podbean now. SoundCloud, I'm going to keep uploading there, but Podbean is the best place to go. Any podcast provider will be getting its feed from there. So for most of you guys listening, that won't have changed, but trchfic.podbean.com, that's a cool place to read all the show notes because it reads all the album art and it lets me format the text. And I've got web pages there. The Trchfic map is up there. If you don't know what that is, go look. And I don't think there's anything else I can possibly say except the most important thing you can do for the show, which is spread the word. Tell your friends, tell your family, and tell the massive mega corporation which is trying to steal your creative rights away from you. Tell them, let them know, because they could benefit from hearing the wise words of myself and Deathblade. It would be a righteous thing to do. And on that note, 再见.